let's talk about weakness in a slightly more direct and personal way. You remember that final scene from the movie The Death of Stalin, where the head of the secret police, Lavrentiy Beria, is executed for his crimes. Around his body, the high-ranking officials of the Soviet regime are watching, including Malenkov, the interim leader, who, although reluctant, gave in to the decision. Khrushchev, now the new leader, turns to Kaganovich and asks a question that hangs in the air. Can you trust a weak man? Kaganovich responds without hesitation. Have you ever trusted a weak man? That line has always moved me. We have this view that weakness is something neutral. There are weak people but with good hearts, just as there are strong people who don't always act ethically. But the movie presents us with a different perspective. Weakness as something limiting, almost incapable of inspiring trust. And when you stop to think about it, it becomes clear how often, in many situations, weakness can indeed hold us back and prevent us from moving forward. I decided to bring up this topic because today we're going to face head-on what it means to be weak and understand why it bothered the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche so much. Nietzsche didn't see weakness as a characteristic that can simply be ignored or considered neutral. For him, weakness had a dangerous side, an inability to be honest with oneself and with the world around them. This is where his reflections begin to make sense for us. Get ready for a new perspective on strength and weakness, a view that could change the way you see your own choices and even your relationships. We will explore why weakness, for Nietzsche, goes hand in hand with unhappiness, why true goodness only arises from strength, and how honesty is the key to all of this. It's important to remember that this is just a fragment of Nietzsche's ideas on weakness. What I've brought here are aspects that make sense in our current context and that can open your mind to deeper reflection. It all starts with Nietzsche's fundamental notion that weakness, at its core, is a form of dishonesty. Now, let's move on to another story, this time with a more melancholic touch. In one of Dostoevsky's tales, the protagonist falls hopelessly in love with a young woman named Nastinka. They spend several nights together, talking about life, and she opens her heart, confessing that she's in love with someone else, someone she believes has abandoned her. Over time, Nastinka seems to grow fond of our narrator, to the point of considering staying with him, but at the last moment, Nastinka's former lover reappears, and she runs to him, leaving our protagonist alone and devastated. What's interesting? Here is how the narrator tries to convince himself that he's at peace with the situation. He tells himself that at least she's happy now, but deep down, there is still an unresolved desire and pain. This story clearly illustrates what Nietzsche means by weakness and the dishonesty that comes with it. It's not about lacking physical strength or being insecure. It's about being unable to be honest with your own feelings, even when it hurts. This vision of Nietzsche's on weakness and dishonesty permeates many of his works, especially Thus Spoke Zarathustra and Beyond Good and Evil. For him, true weakness is being unable to act in accordance with one's own will, letting circumstances and unfulfilled desires control one's life. From here, the invitation is to reflect. How many times do we pretend to be fine when, in reality, we want to shout to the world what we feel? And, more importantly, how can we overcome that weakness that binds us and learn to be honest, strong, and true to ourselves? Keep in mind that Nietzsche addresses weakness very differently in various contexts, and this is one of the most common ones. The weakness of someone who has a goal but, for some reason, cannot reach it. This is the case for figures like Napoleon, who, despite all his power and determination, did not succeed in creating the glorious empire he desired. Nietzsche doesn't see this inability to achieve a goal as a problem in itself. However, what really bothers him is when this weakness leads to dishonesty with oneself. An example of this is in the protagonist of White Nights. At the end of the story, he tries to convince himself that he is fine with his situation, but the truth is that he is not. Nietzsche identifies this kind of behavior as a much deeper form of weakness, one that he intensely despises. Instead of facing reality head-on, admitting that his desire was frustrated and dealing with it, the narrator prefers to deceive himself, escaping into a fantasy that prevents him from accepting the truth. Instead of continuing to try to win Nastenka's affection or seeking a way to grow personally, he simply pretends that he no longer wants her. For Nietzsche, this is a weakness that reflects the inability to overcome oneself and dominate or direct one's own will. There is no real change here, just an attempt to escape a painful truth. This idea will be essential in the next section. Nietzsche believes that, at the extreme, this weakness can turn into resentment and bitterness. In his genealogy of morals, he suggests that when people cannot get what they truly desire, be it power, love, independence, or recognition, they begin to devalue those very desires. Instead of admitting their failure, they prefer to tell themselves, "I didn't really want it," turning something they once valued into something contemptible. A classic example of this resentment is the famous archetype of the nice guy. On the internet, this type of person is the one who declares his love, exalts all the qualities of the person he desires, and emphasizes that he is different from other guys. However, when rejected, he changes the game. He starts insulting the person he once adored, attacking everything from their appearance to their morality. The narrative shifts dramatically, and he complains that girls never choose the nice guys. This is the perfect example of the resentful weakness that Nietzsche describes. I recently saw an excellent video by YouTuber The Authentic Observer on this topic. This analysis made me see the connection between the resentment Nietzsche talks about and the behavior of the nice guy. Much like Aesop's famous fox who couldn't reach the grapes and decided they were sour, the nice guy belittles the person who rejected his affection, turning the unfulfilled desire into something he now despises. Do you know that disguised, somewhat sneaky way Nietzsche criticizes so much? Well, yes, it's present in the behavior of the famous nice guy. This type of person ends up despising precisely the qualities he believes might have helped him succeed with the person he loves. He looks at the more confident or attractive people with a certain contempt, almost as if trying to invalidate their success in romance. And then comes that moral justification. It's okay, I was rejected, but deep down I'm better than I'd need to be accepted. But according to Nietzsche, this is nothing more than a form of self-deception and dishonest way of comforting oneself. This little act of the nice guy with the object of his affection is almost a perfect summary of what Nietzsche observes in the attitudes of the more fragile people when they are in a group. Instead of going after what they truly desire, they prefer to belittle those desires and point their fingers at those who fulfill them, calling them wrong or immoral. Nietzsche detests this behavior because he believes it forces those who could achieve satisfaction to stifle their own will, just to avoid judgment and disapproval from others. And the worst part is that this becomes an endless cycle. Strength and the ability to achieve goals are seen as something condemnable, while the pursuit of self-overcoming and mastering one's own will is lost. This vicious circle creates more and more resentful and dissatisfied people who only complain about the happiness of others as if it were immoral. That's Nietzsche's view. Sure, you might disagree with him, but it's worth reflecting on this. This resentful morality is one of the reasons why Nietzsche calls himself an immoralist at times. He wants to make it clear that he doesn't care about that morality which represses and castrates people's desires. But so far, we've only talked about external weaknesses. Nietzsche goes much further than that, exploring deeper nuances, also addressing internal weaknesses, those that hold us back from within. Among these weaknesses, Nietzsche speaks about the guilt-free pursuit of one's own desires, without adhering to moral standards and without always thinking about the well-being of others. He criticizes hedonism not for being unethical, but for showing a lack of organization in one's own will. However, before delving into this, it's worth remembering that Nietzsche's concept of will is complex and highly debated. He himself revisits some points throughout his works, especially in his posthumous writings. So, what I'm sharing here is my interpretation, and it might not do justice to everything he wrote later. In Nietzsche's final writings, he begins to use the term weakness in a very different way. Now, weakness is no longer just a matter of physical or external strength. It comes to represent something much deeper, related to the organization of one's own will. Nietzsche viewed the will in a very unique way, almost as if our mind were composed of several internal forces, each pulling in different directions, competing to guide us in various ways. This idea might seem a bit abstract, but it fits well with what we experience daily. True, imagine that. At one moment, you want to make a cup of tea, but then you think about cooking something, and before you decide, the desire to go to the store and buy something different to snack on arises. These impulses, each pulling in a different direction, might seem trivial, but when they're not organized coherently, they end up leaving us disoriented and without clear direction. And this is where Nietzsche talks about disorganized will. When we can't coordinate our desires and act with focus, we become paralyzed, unable to take firm steps in the direction we want. It's easy to see how this connects with the idea of weakness he mentioned earlier. If we can't make consistent decisions and commit to them, we end up sidelining our desires and dreams. This lack of direction leads us to a kind of nihilism where, without solid principles to guide us, we end up doing nothing significant. An interesting example is that of King Edward II of England. Although he had immense brute strength and all the power of the throne, his mind was unstable and easily influenced by the court favorites. He wavered so much that, eventually, that inconsistency led him to lose the crown and, tragically, his life. A king with power but no control over his own will was toppled by his own weakness. Another point in Nietzsche's philosophy that deserves attention is his concept of commitment, truly committing to something. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he talks about the final stage of the Bermensch, which he calls the child. This stage symbolizes the ability to create and follow one's own values, guiding one's actions based on principles that one chooses. At this point, the Bermensch defines their own path and avoids both the nihilism of inaction and that of dispersion, where the will is divided so much that it commits to nothing, losing itself in 1,000 directions. Nietzsche was not just talking about how to strengthen oneself, but about how to give meaning and direction to our will, so that we can finally live according to what we truly choose. This idea of weakness has a very strong relationship with Nietzsche's concept of self-overcoming. At first glance, it seems a bit complicated because Nietzsche explores the term in several subtle ways. But basically, we're talking about the will's capacity to align itself and follow a single direction. In other words, the will manages to impose strength upon itself. This is what self-overcoming consists of. Nietzsche uses the terms power and weakness in a way that is different from what we are accustomed to. Power is not only about achieving goals, it's also about overcoming resistances, especially those that come from within. It's like keeping the will firm and directed, almost like an intention that remains unshakable. Imagine this as a determination that does not waver, an inner strength that maintains focus. To illustrate this, we can think of the character Malenkov in the movie The Death of Stalin. He is portrayed as someone without a firm will, changing sides depending on the influence of whoever is speaking to him. Ultimately, he shows, in a way, that weakness Nietzsche would criticize: the inability to resist external influences and maintain a position that is truly his own. Malenkov's will is not his own. It belongs to whoever influenced him most recently. Of course, this is a representation from the movie, not a historical judgment of the real Malenkov. Nietzsche despised this kind of weakness, and even the characters in The Death of Stalin condemn this behavior. People like that cannot be trusted, neither by others nor by themselves. When someone is fickle, their words lose value. The philosopher Byung Chul Han argues that trust exists precisely to fill that gap of control and information. We can never know for certain what others will do, so we depend on trust to bet that they will fulfill their promises. Being reliable in this sense is having power because people begin to believe what you say and depend on you, something Nietzsche suggests that, deep down, everyone desires. In Malenkov's case, he was not considered fit to lead the Soviet Union precisely because of that weakness and lack of firmness. It's as if the political comedy of the movie offers a philosophical lesson. Nietzsche also condemns this lack of organization in the will because he believes that, without a structured will, it is impossible to overcome nihilism and, for him, achieving great accomplishments that give meaning to human existence is what sets us apart from other beings. Nietzsche had an intriguing obsession. He wanted humanity to reach its full potential, and for that, he believed that all the different facets of our will needed to follow a single direction. According to him, it is impossible to lead a truly meaningful life if our will is not so much strong as aligned under our control. This is not just a practical reasoning, although it is that, as well. Without that consistency, the people around us will hardly trust us, which ultimately makes our goals harder to achieve. But here, there's also a deeper philosophical issue. Nietzsche believed that, without a powerful and organized will, any suffering or difficulty could push us directly into nihilism, into contempt for our own life. This idea is fundamental in Nietzsche's philosophy and makes us realize that weakness is not as harmless as it sometimes seems. In our days, this sounds almost familiar. A disorganized will means that others cannot trust us, but worse yet, neither can we trust ourselves. And that lack of self-trust can destabilize us in all aspects of life. With this in mind, let's dive into one of Nietzsche's most controversial stances, his view that human compassion is not as innocent as it seems. For him, this feeling can, in many cases, be disastrously destructive. In general, we are encouraged to be compassionate from a young age. We learn to care for those in more fragile situations, and compassion is often the chosen path to do so. But Nietzsche, contrary to what many think, did not promote a cruel or abusive stance. He saw that kind of attitude as a demonstration of insecurity. However, he had a deep critique of using compassion as a mechanism to motivate help, perceiving this as somewhat false and with the potential for unexpected negative consequences. As is common with Nietzsche's ideas, this view is controversial, and while there may be something valuable in it, don't feel obligated to agree with everything. Just because Nietzsche said something, that doesn't make it an absolute truth. For Nietzsche, the quest for power occupies a central place in human psychology. He believed that our desire to obtain power, whether over ourselves or the world around us, shapes a series of behaviors such as professional ambitions, wealth accumulation, practices of self-sacrifice, and even martyrdom, and for him, compassion, especially when it is solicited, was deeply linked to this power dynamic. Nietzsche saw compassion for those with little power as a kind of subtle weapon. Rather than acting directly, these people would use compassion to recruit the help of others without necessarily taking any responsibility or owing anything in return. This is very different from asking for help from a friend or making an equal exchange. In Nietzsche's view, people who ask for pity without giving something in return end up positioning themselves as helpless, almost childlike, as if saying, "I can't do anything for myself, so someone else needs to do it for me." For Nietzsche, this was a form of dishonesty, and he believed that nature values honesty deeply in relationships. An example of this can be seen in the comparison with a joke where someone provokes stronger people, and when they get a response on their level, they say something like, "Oh, don't hit me. I'm just a poor wretch." This manipulative tactic seeks to influence others through pity, using false vulnerability as a shield. Nietzsche criticized pity for two main reasons. First, for the dishonesty, this way of manipulating others without bearing the weight of one's own requests. And second, because he believed that, in the long run, this dynamic doesn't bring lasting benefits. Relying on pity to sustain oneself may work in the short term, but over time it leads to a sense of devaluation and emptiness, as the person realizes they are never really achieving what they desire. In the end, seeking pity may even be an attempt to relieve a difficult situation, but deep down, that situation remains negative. For Nietzsche, true strength and authenticity come from not depending on others to bear our difficulties, but facing them head-on, with honesty and responsibility. Let's talk about a powerful concept Nietzsche had regarding pity and magnanimity. He saw pity, especially when it came from someone stronger, as something disguised as condescension. For him, magnanimity was completely different. It's when a person is so secure in themselves, so full of their strength, that they help others because they want to, because their cup overflows. But the act of offering pity, well, Nietzsche saw it as a trap, something that ensnares and weakens the other, feeding a dependency. Even if it comes from a position of power, it is dishonest, and according to Nietzsche, nature itself detests anything that contains even a hint of falseness. To explain this better, think of an abusive relationship. Sometimes an abusive person uses manipulative tactics to make their partner depend on them. The strategy may include belittling the partner's abilities until they are convinced that they wouldn't survive without this help. Over time, the person ends up believing this idea, as they have no new evidence to prove otherwise. This type of control is what Nietzsche compares to disguised pity, the intention to keep the other trapped, absorbing their autonomy for personal benefit. Now imagine that the victim in that relationship even asked for help, admitted being overwhelmed by life. In a healthy situation, the partner would encourage the other to find their own strength, to regain their independence little by little. Nietzsche thought that the pious person does the opposite, as if saying, I help, but only because I want you to depend on me, thus increasing my power over you. It's like a loan with high interest, something that only brings more submission. Nietzsche describes in Beyond Good and Evil that the new philosophers, those he believed would be the true value transformers for the future, should go against this mentality of pity. Instead, they should encourage everyone to embrace their own impulse for power, helping to develop their strength, not weaken it. This is one of the messages of Thus Spoke Zarathustra for his followers. Furthermore, nature would see that attitude as magnanimity, not pity. These new thinkers don't manipulate the weak. They genuinely dedicate themselves to helping them strengthen their own foundations. It may seem subtle, but the difference between an abusive relationship and one that truly helps is the same as the one Nietzsche used to illustrate the dynamic between pity and true help. For him, that toxic interaction was a consequence of weakness, both from the one seeking pity to gain some control, and from the one offering pity to keep the other under their domination. Whoever is truly strong, according to Nietzsche, would act with magnanimity and not use the situation maliciously. Nietzsche believed that the greatest power was to be so secure in oneself, so independent and confident, that there was no need to reaffirm that power over anyone to remember that it exists. You know it's there, and you feel good about it, to the point where you can even value the power of others and the rivalry that comes from it. That's the kind of strength that, instead of hiding behind manipulation, genuinely seeks to help from the heart. Nietzsche saw Goethe as the closest example of what he called the Übermensch. But he was not a commander of armies or a tyrant. He was a creative genius, someone who revolutionized Europe just with his talent and intellect. This example helps dismantle the image of Nietzsche as a defender of despotism. In reality, what he despised was weakness disguised as pity, the falseness of help that only serves to control. And it is precisely here that we find one of the deepest and most intriguing roots of Nietzsche's philosophy: the rejection of a life guided by weakness and the pursuit of a true affirmation of existence. Have you ever stopped to think about how we should evaluate a philosophy of life? Many would answer that we measure it by its truth. Nietzsche, however, had a slightly different view. He was not against the idea of truth, but he believed that philosophies dealing with the value of life or how to live it could not be judged objectively. In the end, we are all trapped in our own point of view, and our experience is limited to what we have lived. When we go around affirming how life is, we truly forget that we only have access to our inner world. We don't even manage to look at life from the outside in an impartial way. This is why Nietzsche distanced himself from pessimism and the philosophies that accompanied it. He realized that trying to judge life in its entirety, separated from each person's experiences, was actually quite absurd. Since we cannot evaluate life in a rational or objective way, Nietzsche offers us a choice. We can reject life and consider it negative, or we can embrace it and consider it positive. But there is a trap in each choice. Denying life is a path that leads to self-destruction, while accepting life is an enormous challenge, perhaps one of the greatest that exists. It is at this point that Nietzsche introduces a fascinating concept: amor fati, or love of fate. Inspired by the Stoics, Nietzsche took this idea to an extreme. He wanted to understand how we could love life, even in its darkest and most unpleasant parts. And for him, this was not just an intellectual exercise. Nietzsche spent much of his life dealing with a chronic illness that would leave him bedridden. For long periods, instead of lamenting, he used that pain as a kind of fuel for his reflections. That suffering took on a meaning. something he almost took pride in carrying. This is how he found a way to accept and even celebrate pain. But he knew that this love of fate demanded a very particular type of strength. It was not power over others, but the power to overcome oneself. Interestingly, this form of strength led Nietzsche to deeply admire figures like Jesus. Yes, he criticized Christianity, but he saw in Jesus an example of extreme self-control, absence of resentment, and even a dose of love for fate. Jesus was not a conqueror, but for Nietzsche, his inner strength was colossal. On the other hand, Nietzsche believed that thinkers of weaker spirits could be dangerous, causing harm not only to themselves, but also to those around them and to society. This intense view of Nietzsche, that accepting and loving even the cruelest parts of life can strengthen us, continues to inspire, though following that path requires enormous courage. In Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche delivers a sharp critique of Socrates, one of the great pillars of philosophy. He questions Socrates' stance toward his condemnation and death, especially the way the philosopher dealt with life. In Plato's Phaedo, Socrates defends that a true philosopher does not fear death. For him, dying would be a liberation from physical limitations and an escape from the indignities of the body. This view that reason must devalue life was not only held by Socrates. Schopenhauer also defended it, describing existence as an almost unbearable weight, something to endure until peace is found in non-existence. Nietzsche, if he were here today, would probably criticize the anti-natalist movement in the same way. In the end, this current suggests that it is not worth starting a life due to the inevitable suffering it brings. For Nietzsche, such thoughts are signs of weakness, a surrender disguised as philosophy. It is the opposite of amor fati, the love of fate that he so strongly defended, a visceral commitment to life, regardless of the difficulties, instead of embracing life as it is. These philosophies promote an intellectual distancing, as if life was something to avoid. But why does this matter? Nietzsche believed that this way of thinking, when it spreads in society, acts like a poison that corrodes its values and weakens its members, eventually leading them to decadence. He saw this same dynamic in Christianity, especially in the version preached by St. Paul, which exalted chastity and self-denial. Although he admired Jesus, Nietzsche criticized the idea of seeing this life as only a preparation for something greater in the afterlife. For him, this conception emptied the value of the present, encouraging people to despise earthly life in favor of a future hope. By denying our most basic impulses, Nietzsche believed that we were disconnecting ourselves from what makes us alive and strong. He saw this denial as a theft of our vital energy, that fierce instinct that drives us to fight and live fully. And in his view, the philosophies created by those he considered weak ended up spreading that same weakness. It was as if there were a dynamic of misery that adores company. Those who feel weakened, whether physically or emotionally, tend to drag others into that same limited vision of life. One way to spread this weakness is by using morality as a weapon, but another is to spread the idea that life itself is not worth much. And if we believe that life has no value, what drives us to enjoy it? Why seek meaning, fight for what we want, or even get out of bed every day? Nietzsche believed that certain philosophies of weakness that deny life only darken it and spread a destructive energy that prevents people from becoming what they can truly be.